Hi everyone, this is part of probably one of the most important topics that we're going to talk about within the Cash Level 3 program. It's understanding how to plan and lead activities. In this video, I'm not going to cover the entire Unit 3.2. However, I will focus on how to create and plan activities. And I think that this is using the templates that we provide you within the course. This is something, a task that you will need for many, many other units. You'll notice that several of the cash units have activities or tasks that you have to complete that include creating an activity plan. So hopefully this video will benefit you for the task that you have to do for this unit, as well as several other units as well. So before you start to plan an activity, you have to think about all of the different theoretical approaches. We are not going to cover them in this unit in detail. We're going to do that in other sections, and there are some reading materials that you need to look at as well. But you need to look at the theoretical approaches, and you also need to understand all the most important theorists, Piaget, Vygotsky, and so forth. Because when you're planning an activity, all of that is affected by the kind of approach, by the kind of vision that the program has. Your childcare center may already be using one of these learning approaches, but they will have an effect on the types of activities that you plan. So you need to keep those in mind, and you need to, if your childcare's program or your kindergarten or your early childhood center is really relying on one of these approaches, then you really need to understand the vision, the mission, the passion behind it. You need to understand what the role of the teacher is. You need to understand basic differences between how is reading, language, and communication developed within this approach. What do they believe when we talk about play-based learning? Some of them have slightly different views of the child, and then as you saw in the pictures before, they also have a different understanding to the way how the physical environment is set up as well. So I really recommend, before you even start watching this video, go back and look at the different approaches, look at the different theorists, and then come back and continue with me. So when you're creating a plan, again, using the templates that we provide you, one of the most basic things to add to that plan, of course, you need to date it. You need to think about the age range. Why do you need to think about the age range of the children? Because it kind of enables you to understand, is to make sure that the resources that you have is applicable for that age range, to make sure that they're developmentally appropriate. So whatever activity that you're going to plan for those children is going to be developmentally appropriate. And we're going to talk about developmentally appropriateness in a bit. You also need to think about what areas of learning and development is this activity helping to achieve. So again, in this CASH programs, they refer to the EYFS, which is the British, the UK framework, the early years foundation stage. But that doesn't mean that you can't use this same strategy to link it to any other curriculum framework that you may be using as well. So it's important to think about, to start with the end in mind, right? The 7 habits of the highly effective people. So you know that one of those habits is to start with the end in mind. So we need to think about that objective. And there's a good reason for that, because when you do an activity that is helping to, for example, to develop their mathematical skills, right? You may do something just by, for example, counting some ducks in a book, right? So you may do that by default, or you may do that naturally. But when you have the end in mind, when you are keeping that objective in your mind, that makes whatever activity that you are doing with those children 100 times more powerful, because it's intentional, and things need to be intentional. Let's keep going with the plan. So, of course, we want to think about the aims of the activities, linking it to the learning developmental areas. You want to also be very conscious about what kind of resources will I need. Are these resources that I have access to? If you are planning a remote session, we have some training courses on engaging children through remote sessions as well. Are these resources things that they have available at home, and so forth? And then you want to write a good description of that activity. Now, think about that description, because you want to be able to share these resources with other teachers and with other educators. So is that description good enough to explaining how that activity is going to be carried out? And you want to imagine that, you want to imagine that you're preparing this beautiful activity plan that will be understandable by other educators, by your instructor, by your assessor, and that is useful, right? Who knows? We've seen teachers throughout, by the end of their CASH Level 3 program, have this collection of beautiful activity plans that they've created as part of their portfolio, something that they're so proud of. And there's a reason to have these plans ready. You need to develop these skills. Although in the future, once you get so used to thinking systematically like this, thinking strategically, these will come so second nature to you. So it may feel like in the next couple of slides that you might be like overwhelmed, but I promise that it does get easier. You do start kind of unconsciously thinking and doing all of these things as you go on in your professional career. It's also very important to create a balance. What do we mean by create a balance? So you need to be careful that it's not one directional activity. So it's not something that is only like adult led, right? And also something that is free play is great, but for the purposes of the CASH program specifically, you don't want it only to be free play. You want to create that balance where you're kind of, as a teacher, preparing the resources, giving that opportunity to the children, presenting them, presenting them with that challenge, with that experience, and then allowing them to engage and take it to the level that's appropriate for them. So you want to find that balance. So it's not something that would be purely adult-led, is like seating the kids in a circle and then you sitting with all of the resources and then you like showing them something, right? And then making them repeat after you, or giving them a worksheet and asking them to trace it. That's very adult-led. That's not, they don't really have a say, right? You're telling them when they can do something and how they should do it. That's very adult-led, and I hope that doesn't take over all of the kinds of activities that you want to do. You want to invite children to make decisions. You want to develop their independence. You don't want children to be waiting either. So it's very important that, for example, if you have one activity or 2 or 3 pieces of Play-Doh, and if you have 10 children, of course, you're not going to have, that's not the right activity for the right group size. So you're going to have, because you're going to have a lot of children waiting. So that wait period is very important as well. So you need to make sure to create that balance between the adult-led and the child-led activities. It's also important to think about, what will the children do? So here's what I'm going to do as the teacher, but how do you think that children will engage? How do you think that they're going to, what kind of say will they have? Like I said a minute ago, how much waiting are they going to do to actually take part in the activity? Is it something that you have to do with each child? So are children waiting? What can children do while they're waiting, for example, right? Maybe there's 2 or 3 activities or 2 or 3 opportunities that you can plan. So if you're working with one small group, the other 2 groups are working on something else, and then you can kind of switch and go over to the next group. You need to think about those kind of things and how the children will be interacting with that activity. You also need to think about where the activity will take place, right? How long will it last? I mean, you can think sometimes the timing is important because sometimes the kids enjoy so much an activity and it's so important for them to be able to finish an activity. So sometimes if you don't give them enough time, you'll see, some challenging behavior. You'll see children get upset because they wanted more time to finish a specific activity. But then other times the activity is so boring they can't wait until it's finished and go on to the next thing, right? So you need to think about how long that activity will last and be flexible. So if children want to have some more time to finish off something, or if you feel there's one or two children that are really engaged with something, either give them, maybe promise them some time at the end of the day or at another day, and then remember to keep that promise, right? It's very important to keep that promise. Or give them a few extra minutes to finish off what they were doing. So you need to think about the length of the activity as well. It's very important to think about the role of the adult. And that doesn't mean the role of only you as a teacher. You want to think about if there may be other adults with you in the classroom, right? So what is the role of all of the adults, whether that's you, a teaching assistant, or another teacher, right? You want to think about that everybody is kind of working in harmony. And that's one of the reasons that I said a minute ago why actually writing out a description is so important for these activity plans, because I suggest that you share this before you actually doing it with the kids. Share it with your fellow peers and the other adults that are with you in the class. You need to be on the same page. You need to know what each of you are doing. The roles and responsibilities for each one have to be very clear. The next important part is the key vocabulary. What is that? Vocabulary means that, for example, let's say you are doing an activity. Let's go take the math and the yellow ducks again. So maybe the vocabulary there is, let's say you were working with toddlers, maybe 15-month-old children or 10-month-old children, right? And your math activity was counting the yellow ducks. Your key vocabulary could be yellow, ducks, numbers, right? Up, down, jumping. They are words to help you remember to use, to help build that vocabulary, to help build that language while you're doing the activity. So it's like reminders. So for you to actually think in advance, during this activity, what kind of words can I help to enhance the vocabulary? What words can I use during the activity to help stimulate that beautiful minds of the toddlers and to help keep me focused? Because oftentimes you'll notice that when you're engaged in an activity and you're having so much fun and you're playing with the kids, sometimes you forget that you should be talking and describing, and sometimes you need to use, as children grow, you need to build on that vocabulary and sometimes use more and more complex vocabulary, because guess what? Skill begets skill. So the more difficult and advanced words and the complex vocabularies build on the easy ones. So as we may, in the toddler years, we have easy words like up and down and 1, 2, 3, and then that builds. So when they go into preschool, then those words build, and then they're thinking about besides and above and next to and not far from, and so you can see how that vocabulary kind of builds. So if you don't give them those opportunities when they're earlier, how can you kind of build that foundation as they move on? So identifying what kind of words you're going to use during the activity is super, super important. Another important thing is to help build cognitive skills is questions. What questions are you going to ask children? Now, please don't ask children questions that you know the answer to. Ask questions about wonder, Ask questions about feelings, about emotions, about thoughts, about things, interesting things. Don't ask children about what color it is. That's kind of, that's yellow. It's like you're testing them. We're not testing them with questions. We're discussing with them. We're inspiring them. We want to see what they're passionate about, what they're interested in. Those are the kind of questions that you want to ask them. Another important thing to think about when you're planning an activity is differentiation. So you can't do the same activity for all your kids. Even if all your kids were 15 months old, the same activity won't be appropriate for all of your kids, all your 15 months old, right? Because different children develop at their own pace, at their own rate, right? And no matter what you do, no matter even if they were in the same preschool and the same nursery and the same childcare center, children just develop differently for so many different reasons. So you need to identify in your activity plan, how are you going to make it different? How are you going to allow for the differentiation, right? How will you respect the different speeds, the different levels, the different abilities of your children while doing the same activity, right? So you need to think about the age appropriateness. You need to think about, is it individually appropriate? You need to think about the culturally appropriateness. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. One concept you need to understand, and really this will change your life with how you're working with kids, is something called the ZPD, or the Zone of Proximal Development. It's a really complex word, but a very simple concept. It means that if something is too easy, then kids get bored. If it's too hard, then they feel stressed and they get anxiety. You need to have it just right. You know the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears? Well, this is exactly the same thing. So remember, Goldilocks didn't like the porridge. It was too hot. And the other one was too cold. And the last one was what? Just right, right? So activities need to be the same way. It can't be too easy and it can't be too hard. So the idea is, where do you find that sweet spot? Where do you find it like challenging but still achievable? And the trick is that, of course, you can't really do this unless you know your kids' abilities really well, unless you're observing them, unless you're assessing them. And later in the units we'll talk more about observation and assessment. But when you're kind of giving them that support and helping them a little bit, but then allowing them to struggle just enough so that they can eventually achieve it within a little bit of the time, right? So providing them just with a little bit of support that is enough to enable them to do or to complete the activity and feel that sense of accomplishment, feel that sense of happiness for actually doing something. And like I said before, it's not possible unless you know your learners. So we are going to talk a lot about assessment and observation in other units, but there's just so many ways to observe learners. And really, it's kind of tricky. I mean, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? And in this case, observation always comes first. But we're kind of talking about activity planning first, but not to worry. We're going to talk about the observations later. And there's so many different types of observations so that you can really get to know the skill levels of your children. When talking about the term DAP, so one of the acronyms that I just mentioned was ZPD, that was the Zone of Proximal Development. And here's the other one, DAP. This is Developmentally Appropriate Practice. And this is linked with the differentiation that I was telling you. So it's developmentally appropriate means that it's appropriate for their development, right? So what are you considering? What does DAP mean, DAP? It means that you're considering their individual characteristic. So is it, do they have, the right attention span? the activity level? Is it, is it matching their learning styles? I mean, all of you. Some of you prefer to jump right ahead and read the reading material. Some of you are more auditory or visual. They like to listen or watch these videos, right? All of you are different, and the kids are different too. They have different abilities. They may have different disabilities. We all have a disability, right? Everybody has a disability. We may have different skills. So a child who's, just my preschooler has been spending a lot of time in the garden in the past couple of months, and interestingly has some skills and knowledge working in the garden and using the different tools and the machinery. Obviously, I don't know anything about that, but he has some interesting skills and knowledge that other children might not have. That's very individual to that child, right? My child also has very special interests. So, for example, my son is just fascinated with earthquakes and volcanoes, and can name for you all the different types of volcanoes, what the different machines are to use to measure these, and all kinds of. So they have all of these individual characteristics. This information is so valuable for you. You can use this information to plan activities to keep kids engaged. I mean, knowing that, for example, a small group of your kids are just fascinated with, let's say volcanoes or trucks or earthquakes or whatever it is. If you plan activities using that information, maybe planning, doing a simulation of a volcano erupting or something, imagine how engaged those kids would be. Imagine how you could get them that level of interest, getting them engaged, and then keeping that window of opportunity to help create that learning experience. I mean, that's just magic. Another important thing is really understanding the cultural considerations. So you need to know about the family composition. You need to know about the birth order, and there are just so many interesting things done on birth order. There's so much you can know about characteristic, even about yourself and about your kids as well, understanding the birth order, about the home emotional climate, about the ethnic background, the cultural practices, the home language, right? Children learn differently, right? The parents' education also, the socioeconomic status, all this information is so important to help you to prepare engaging sessions. There's also lots of different differentiation strategies that you can use, and one of the different ones that you can adjust your groups. So you can use you can segregate the kids in different groups. You can have do the activity in a large group or a small group, or decide that this activity has to be done one-to-one. You can use visuals and verbal instructions. You can use manipulatives, right? Model or demonstrate something, role play. You can put buddies together, so you can put two kids together, not necessarily at the same developmentally stage. You can mix and match so that a child is supporting the other, another child. So building that social emotional skill and support and empathy, for example. And you can also embed learning opportunities strategically into the daily routine. So without them even knowing it, you can, for example, ask everybody to hop on their right leg while they're on their way to go and wash their hands. Well, that's lots of cognitive development, physical development, and that was within a transition in their daily routine. They didn't really even think about it as an activity, but that was an activity. You also need to think about the environment. So it's very important to think about different aspects of the environment. So what do I mean? You need to think about the physical environment, the physical features. So how is it set up? The number of children. Does my environment really support child-initiated play or not? I remember out of the hundreds of childcare programs and early childhood programs that I visited, one program that I visited had so many tables and chairs in the classroom, there was literally no place for the kids to actually walk and walk around and do anything. All the kids could do is to sit on their chairs and tables and just be handed worksheets. I mean, what kind of physical environment is that? What kind of child-initiated play does that environment support? So you need to think about, I mean, this is extreme what I'm describing to you, but you need to think about the environment. Does your environment support collaboration or not? The way how you segregate your learning centers, for example, your areas, even the placement of the rugs, it can either encourage or discourage social collaboration. You need to also think about, are you respecting the cultural characteristics of the children? Does your classroom represent every single culture in your classroom? What about the clothes, the signs, the pictures, the books that are represented in your classroom? You also need to think about the personal features of the environment. Do your children have their space? Do they feel welcome? Is their artwork respected, valued, celebrated? Do they have that personal space? So all of those things are very important when you're thinking about planning your activity. I wish you good luck in using the templates, and take it slowly. I know that sometimes the template may look a little daunting, but try to print out a couple copies, use a paper and pen, and just imagine a simple activity. Work on one area at a time in the template. Answer all the questions that we've discussed in the video today. Try it out, and don't forget to try it out with a group of children, and don't forget to fill out the reflection pieces and the questions that are at the bottom of the template to help you reflect on how it went and how you could improve it further. And I wish you good luck.